Good evening. I'm going to tell a story by Richard Matheson, The Funeral, published in 1955. This story contains over a dozen words that I was unfamiliar with when I first read the story. I had to look them up. I've included them in front of this program, in case some of you are also unfamiliar with them. I do want to mention two of them before I start. I'm not going over the whole list because you'll be able to figure out many of them from the context, but there are two that occur early on that I want to mention. The first is obsequies. Obsequies are funeral rites. The other is catafalque. A catafalque is a decorative platform often used in a funeral home to support the casket. The Funeral by Richard Matheson. Morton Silkline was in his office musing over floral arrangements for upcoming obsequies. His thoughts were interrupted by the chiming strains of "I'm crossing o'er the bar to join the choir invisible." These chimes announced someone entering Clooney's cut-rate catafalque. Blinking his liver-colored eyes, Silkline knit his fingers to a placid clasp, then settled back against the sable leather of his chair, a smile of funereal welcome on his lips. Out in the stillness of the hallway, footsteps approached along the muffling carpet, moving with a leisured pace. Just before the tall man entered, the desk clock buzzed an acknowledgment to 7:30. Morton Silkline rose from his chair, as if caught in the midst of a tete-a-tete with death's angel. He circled the glossy desk and extended one flaccid-fingered hand. Good evening, sir," he soothed. His smile, a precise compendium of sympathy and welcome. His voice, a calculated drip of obeisance. The man's handshake was cool and bone-cracking, but Silkline managed to confine his reaction to a momentary flicker of agony in his cinnamon eyes. "Won't you be seated?" he murmured, fluttering his bruised hand toward the grieved one's chair. "Thank you," said the man as he seated himself. His voice a polite baritone. He unbuttoned the front of his velvet-collared overcoat and placed his dark Homburg on the glass top of the desk. "My name is Morton Silkline," offered Silkline as he returned to his chair and settled on the cushion like a diffident butterfly. "Asper," replied the man. "May I say that I am proud to meet you, Mr. Asper," Silkline purred. "Thank you," said the man. "Now then," continued Silkline, getting down to the business of bereavement, "what can Clooney's do to ease your sorrow?" The man crossed his dark-trousered legs. "I should like to make arrangements for a funeral service." Silkline nodded once with a "I am here to succor" smile. "Of course, sir, you have come to the right place." His gaze elevated a few inches. "When loved ones lie upon that lonely couch of everlasting sleep," he recited, "let Clooney draw the coverlet." His gaze returned, and he smiled with a modest subservience. "Mrs. Clooney made that up. We like to pass it along to those who come to us for comfort." "Very nice," said the tall man, "extremely poetic. But to details. I would like to engage your largest parlor." "I see," said Silkline, restraining himself, but only with effort from rubbing his hands together. "That would be our eternal rest room." The man nodded affably. "Fine. And I would also like to buy your most expensive casket." Silkline could barely restrain a boyish grin, his cardiac muscle flexing vigorously. He tried his best to hide the folds of sorrowful solicitude on his face. "I'm sure that can be effected." "With gold trimmings?" asked the man. "Why, yes," said Director Silkline, clicking audibly as he swallowed. I'm sure that Clooney's can satisfy your every need during this time of grievous loss." Then his voice slipped from the condoling to the fiduciary. "Naturally, it will entail a bit more expenditure than would otherwise be." "The cost is of no importance," said the man, waving it away. "I want only the best of everything." "It will be so, sir, it will be so," declared a fervent Morton Silkline. "Capital," said the man. Silkline went on briskly. "Now, shall you be wishing our Mr. Mossmound to deliver his sermon on crossing the Great Divide?" "I think not," said the tall man, shaking his head thoughtfully. "A friend of mine will speak at the service." Silkline nodded. "Ah, I see." Reaching forward, he plucked his gold pen from its onyx holder. Then, with 2 fingers of his left hand, he carefully drew out an application form from the ivory box on his desk. He looked up with the accredited expression for the asking of painful questions. "And what is the name of the deceased, may I ask?" "Asper," said the man. Silkline glanced up, smiling politely. "A relative?" "Me," said the man. Silkline's laugh was a faint coughing. "I beg your pardon. I thought you said me," repeated the man. "But I don't, you see," explained the man. "I never had a proper going off. It was catch as catch can, you might say, all improvised. Nothing, how shall I put it, tasty." "I always regretted that. I always intended to make up for it." Morton Silkline returned the pen to its holder with a decisive jabbing of his hand. He rose to his feet, pulsing with a harsh distemper. "Indeed, sir, indeed." The man looked surprised at the vexation of Morton Silkline, and he tried to speak. But Silkline interrupted. "I am as fully prepared as the next fellow for trifling banter, but not during business hours. I think you fail to realize, sir, just where you are. This is Clooney's, a much-respected ossuary, not a place for trivial joking or—" Stopping in mid-sentence, Silkline shrank back and stared with open mouth at the tall man who was suddenly on his feet, his eyes glittering with a light most unseemly. "This is not a joke," he said balefully. "I came here with the most serious purpose in mind." His eyes were glowing now like cherry-bright coals. "And I expect this purpose to be gratified. Do you understand?" Silkline tried to speak. The tall man continued. "On Tuesday next at 8:30 p.m., my friends and I will arrive here for the service. You will have everything prepared by then. Full payments will be made directly following the ceremony. Are there any questions?" Again, Silkline started. Again, the tall man continued. "I need hardly remind you that this matter is of the utmost importance to me." He picked up his Homburg and paused potently. His voice sank to a forbidding basso profundo. "I expect all to go well." Bowing slightly at the waist, he crossed the office in 2 regal strides, pausing for a moment at the door. "Oh, one additional item. That mirror in the foyer? Remove it. And I might add any others that my friends and I might chance upon during our stay in your parlors." He raised one gray-gloved hand. "And now, good night." When Silkline reached the hallway, his customer was just flapping out of a small window. Quite suddenly, Morton Silkline found the floor. They arrived promptly at 8:30, conversing as they entered the foyer. They were met by Director Silkline, his legs trembling, his eyes ringed by the raccoon circles of sleepless nights. "Good evening," greeted the tall man, noting, with a pleased nod, the absence of the mirror on the wall. Silkline tried to reply, but his vocal cords went slack as his dazed eyes moved from figure to figure in the tall man's entourage. The gnarl-faced hunchback, whom Silkline heard addressed as Igor, the peak-hatted crone with a black cat crouched on her shoulder, the hulking, hairy-handed man who clicked his yellow teeth together and regarded Silkline with markedly more than casual eyes, the waxen-featured little man who licked his lips and smiled at Silkline as though he possessed some inner satisfaction, and the half-dozen men and women in evening dress, all cherry-eyed and, Silkline cringed, superbly toothed. Silkline hung against the wall, his mouth a circular entranceway, his hands twitching feebly at his sides. He remained motionless as the chatting assemblage passed him by, heading for the eternal rest room. "Please join us," said the tall man. Silkline stirred fitfully from the wall and wove an erratic path down the hallway, his eyes still saucer round with stupor. The tall man said pleasantly, "I trust everything is well prepared." Silkline squeaked, Oh, yes." "Sterling," said the man. When the two of them entered the room, the others were grouped in a semicircle, admiring the casket. "Is good," muttered the hunchback to himself. "Is good box." The peak-hatted crone stroked her cat and cackled, "Aye, be that a casket or be that a casket, Delphinia?" Delphinia replied, "Meow." The others nodded with felicitous smiles and murmured, "Ah, ah." Then one of the ladies in evening dress said, "Let Ludwig see." And the semicircle split open so the tall man could pass. He ran his long fingers over the gold trim on the sides and the top of the casket, nodding appreciatively. "Splendid," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Quite splendid. Just what I always wanted." "You picked a beauty, lad," said a tall, well-dressed gentleman. "Well, try it on for size," declared the chuckling crone. With a boyish smile, Ludwig climbed into the casket and wriggled into place. "A perfect fit," he said with contentment. "Master, look good," mumbled Igor. "Look good in box." Then the hairy-handed man demanded they begin, because he had an appointment at 9:15. So they all hurried to their chairs. "Come, duck," said the crone, waving a scrawny hand at the ossified Silkline. "Sit by my side. I likes the pretty boys, I do. Eh, Delphinia?" Delphinia said, "Meow." "Please, Jenny," pleaded Ludwig, opening his eyes for a moment. "I'm serious. You know what this means to me." The crone muttered, "Aye, aye," then removed her peaked hat as the zombie-stiff Silkline quivered into place beside her, aided by the guiding hand of the waxen-faced little man. "Hello, pretty boy," whispered the crone, leaning over and jabbing a spear-point elbow into Silkline's ribs. Then the tall, white-haired gentleman from Carpathia rose to his feet, and the service began. Good friends, we have gathered ourselves within these walls to pay homage to our comrade, Ludwig Asper, whom the pious and unyielding fates have chosen to pluck from existence and place within that bleak sarcophagus of all eternity. "C'est j'y," someone murmured. "Schon de signe," said another. Igor wept. The waxen-featured little man sitting on the other side of Morton Silkline leaned over to whisper, "Tasty." But Silkline wasn't sure it was in reference to the funeral address. The gentleman from Carpathia continued, And thus we collect our bitter selves about this our comrade's beer, about this litter of sorrow, this Carn, this Cromlech, this unhappy tumulus. Clearer, clearer, demanded Jenny, stamping one petulant shoe. Meow, said Delphinia. The crone winked one blood-laced eye at Silkline, who shrank away, only to brush against the little man, who gazed at him with beery eyes and murmured once again, Tasty. The white-haired gentleman paused long enough to gaze down his royal nose at the crone. Then he continued. This mastaba, this sorrowing taupe, this got, this dread Dakima. What did he say? Asked Igor. The crone declared, This ain't no declamation, tourney. Keep it crisp, I say. Ludwig raised his head again, a look of pained embarrassment on his face. Jenny, please. The crone snapped, toad's teeth. The Count went on testily. Rest in peace, dear brother. The memory of you shall not perish with your untimely sepulture. You are, dear friend, not so much out of the game as playing on another field. At which the hairy-handed man rose and hulked from the room with the guttural announcement, Must go. Silkline felt an icy chill as he heard the sudden padding of clawed feet in the hallway, and a howling which echoed back along the walls. The little man whispered with a bright-eyed smile, Aldgate says he has a dinner appointment. Silkline was shuddering. The Count stood tall and silent, his red eyes shut, his mouth tight-lipped with aristocratic pique. Count, pleaded Ludwig, please. Am I to endure these vulgar calumnies? Asked the Count. Well, la-dee-da, crooned Jenny to her cat. Silence, woman, roared the Count, his head disappearing for a moment in a white vapor, then reappearing as he gained control. Ludwig sat up, his face a twist of aggravation. Jenny, I think you'd better leave. You think to throw out old Jenny? Challenged the crone. Well, you gotta think that's coming then. She slapped on her pointed hat, and then, as a shriveling Silkline watched, lightning sprouted from her fingertips. Delphinia bristled ebony hairs. The Count stepped forward, hand outstretched to clamp onto the crone's shoulder. Then he stiffened in mid-stride as he found himself ringed by sizzling fire. Ha! Crowed Jenny, as a horrified Silkline gagged. My rug! Jenny! Cried Ludwig, clambering out of the casket. The crone gestured, and all of the flowers in the room began exploding like popcorn. No, moaned Silkline as the curtains flared and split. Chairs were overthrown. The Count transformed into a hissing stream of white carbonate, which flew at Jenny. Jenny flung her arms and vanished in an orange froth, cat and all, as the air grew thick with winged flapping. Just before Morton Silkline toppled forward, the waxen-featured little man leaned over. Smiling toothfully, he squeezed the director's arm and murmured, Tasty. Then Silkline was at one with the rug. Morton Silkline slumped in his sable-leathered chair, still twitching slightly, even though a week had passed since the nerve-splitting event. On his desk lay the note from Ludwig Asper, the note that Asper had left pinned to his chest while he was unconscious. Sir, it read, accept this bag of gold, which I trust will cover all costs. In addition, please accept my regrets that full decorum was not affected by the guests at my funeral. Save for that, the entire preparation was most satisfactory. Silkline put down the note and lovingly touched the hill of glinting coins on his desk. Through judicious inquiry, he had learned of a family connection in Mexico, a cosmetician cousin in Carrillo's cut-rate catacomb. He had learned that his cousin could safely dispose of the gold at mutual profit. All things considered, the affair had not been really as bad as all. Morton Silkline looked up as something entered his office. He would have chosen to leap back screaming and vanish into the flowered pattern of the wallpaper, but he was too petrified. Once more gape-mouthed, he stared at the huge, tentacled, ochre-dripping shapelessness that weaved and swayed before him. It spoke politely. "A friend recommended you to me." Silkline sat bug-eyed for a long moment. Then his twitching hand accidentally touched the mountain of gold on his desk, and he found strength. Breathing through his mouth, he said, "You have come to the right place, sir." He swallowed mightily and braced himself. Then he reached for his gold pen, blowing away the yellow-green smoke which was beginning to obscure the office. "And what is the name of the deceased, may I ask?"